The folder my father threw at me didn't hit me. It landed against the wall with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, papers exploding everywhere. Bank statements, property deeds, my grandmother's handwritten letters. All of it fluttering to the floor like confetti at a funeral. He stood there, red-faced, one arm still outstretched from the throw, and he said, "You need to leave this house right now, and don't you dare come back." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I pulled out my phone and pressed record. That was 8 months ago. What happened next changed everything, not just for me, but for every single person in that room who thought they'd gotten away with it. My grandmother passed in March, 2 days after her 81st birthday. She died the way she lived, quietly, on her own terms, in the house she'd owned for 43 years in Dayton, Ohio. I'd driven up the night before, sat beside her bed while she slept, held her hand through the early morning hours. She passed just before sunrise. I was the only one there. My mother arrived 4 hours later. My uncle, her younger brother, pulled up 20 minutes after that in a new truck I'd never seen before. Neither of them had been to visit in 6 months. I want to be fair here. I know grief makes people complicated. I know that not everyone can sit with dying the way I can. But when my mother walked through that door and her first words were, "Did she say anything about the will?" I think I understood, in a way I hadn't fully let myself understand before, exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. My grandmother had raised me for most of my childhood. My parents went through a rough stretch when I was 7. My father lost his job. My mother was dealing with things she still won't name out loud. And Grandma Cecile took me in without hesitation. She taught me how to cook, how to manage a budget, how to read a lease before you sign it. She used to say, "Baby, nobody's going to protect you in this world except you. So you better learn how everything works." I learned. I took her seriously. I went to school for accounting, got my CPA license at 26, and spent the next 4 years working at a mid-size firm in Columbus. I was careful with money because she'd taught me to be careful with money. And I always planned to pay back what she'd given me. Not in dollars, because she never wanted that, but in time, in presence, in showing up. My parents came back around when I was about 19. Things were more stable for them by then. My father had a decent job in logistics. My mother had reconnected with her brother, my uncle, and the three of them had settled into a kind of rhythm together that I was always slightly outside of. I told myself that was okay. I was independent. I didn't need to be at the center of everything. What I didn't realize was that while I was busy being independent, they were busy making plans. My grandmother's estate lawyer was a man named Mr. Forsyth who had handled her affairs for over 20 years. He called a meeting 2 weeks after the funeral at his office in Dayton. I sat across from my mother and my uncle, a box of tissues on the table, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Mr. Forsyth opened a manila folder. He read for about 3 minutes. The house Grandma Seal had lived in for 43 years, the house I'd grown up in. The house where she'd kept a garden out back and a Bible on the kitchen table, had been transferred out of her estate 14 months earlier. It now belonged jointly to my mother and my uncle, through a revocable living trust that had been amended, according to the document, with her full consent. Her investment accounts, roughly $340,000, built over decades of careful saving, a teacher's pension, and a small inheritance from her own mother, had been redirected into that same trust the previous year. The only thing left in her name when she died was a savings account with $4,200 in it. And that, Mr. Forsyth explained with the careful neutrality of a man who had seen things he couldn't comment on, was to be split 3 ways, between my mother, my uncle, and me. $1,400. I sat very still. I'm good at sitting still when I need to be. It's something else Grandma Cecile taught me. She called it keeping your face. She said it was the most important skill a woman could have, in a room full of people who wanted to see her fall apart. I kept my face. I asked Mr. Forsyth one question. When had the trust been amended? He told me 14 months ago, February of last year. I thanked him and walked out to my car, and I sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes, and then I drove to my grandmother's house. My mother's house now, legally. And I walked through the front door without knocking. My mother was already in the kitchen going through the cabinets. My uncle was in the living room, on the phone, laughing about something. My father was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee like he owned the place. I said, "I want to see the trust documents." My mother turned around with a dish towel in her hand and said, "Sweetheart, we've all had a hard few weeks. Can we do this another time?" "No," I said. "I want to see the trust documents, the amendment. I want to see her signature." The temperature in that room dropped about 10 degrees. My uncle came in from the living room. He and my father exchanged a look I wasn't supposed to catch, but I caught it. It was the kind of look that passes between people who have already had a conversation about what to do if this moment arrived. My father stood up. He said, "Your grandmother made her wishes clear. You have no right to come in here and make accusations." I said, "I haven't made any accusations. I asked to see a document." He said, "You need to leave this house." I said, "I'm not leaving until I see the signature." And that's when he grabbed the folder off the counter and threw it at the wall. Papers, Cecile's letters, her bank statements going back 15 years, a copy of the original will. The one that, I could see even from across the room, had my name in it. The one from before the amendment. I pulled out my phone and pressed record. "Get out," my father said. His voice was low now, which was somehow worse than the yelling. "Get out, and don't come back. You were always ungrateful. You always thought you deserved more than you did." I looked at him. I looked at my mother, who was staring at the floor. I looked at my uncle, who had his arms crossed and was looking somewhere over my left shoulder. I said, "Okay." And I picked up every single piece of paper off that floor before I left. I want to be honest about the next few weeks because I think people sometimes tell these stories like the person wronged them is just laser focused on justice from minute one. That's not how it felt. What it felt like was grief, layered over grief. Layered over grief. I'd just lost my grandmother, and now I was learning that the people who were supposed to be my family had spent the last year, while she was still alive, while she was still sitting at that kitchen table and going to church on Sundays and tending her garden, systematically moving her assets out of her control. I cried. I'm not embarrassed to say that. I cried for about 3 days. And then I called a probate attorney. Her name was Ms. Archer, and she was based in Columbus. And she had 17 years of experience specifically in elder financial exploitation cases. I know that phrase sounds clinical. I know it sounds like something that happens to other people, but that's what it was. There's a legal term for it, and it applied to what had happened to my grandmother. And hearing Ms. Archer say it out loud in her office, calmly and precisely, was both the worst and the most clarifying moment of that entire period. She reviewed everything I'd brought: the original will, the trust documents, the amendment, the bank statements I'd gathered from the papers on the floor, and the audio recording I'd made on my phone. She looked up at me over her reading glasses and said, "This amendment was executed when your grandmother was 80 years old, 14 months before her death. Do you know whether she had any cognitive decline during that period?" I said. "She was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia 18 months ago." Ms. Archer wrote something down. She said, "I'm going to need her medical records. Here's what people don't always know about financial elder abuse in Ohio." And I say Ohio specifically because the statutes matter and I want to be accurate. It's a first-degree misdemeanor at minimum, and it escalates to a felony based on the dollar amount involved. $340,000 plus the value of a home in Dayton puts this firmly in felony territory. The state can pursue criminal charges independent of any civil action. The victim's family cannot drop criminal charges once they're filed. That decision belongs to the prosecutor's office alone. I'm telling you this because one of the things that made me most angry in those early weeks was how much I didn't know. I had a CPA license. I was good with money. I understood financial systems, and I still didn't know half of what I needed to know to protect my grandmother. Because nobody teaches you this stuff until you need it. Ms. Archer filed a petition to contest the trust amendment on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. She also contacted Adult Protective Services, who opened their own investigation, and she referred the financial records to the county prosecutor's office, who, as it turned out, had already received a tip. That tip had come from Grandma Cecile's doctor. He had documented in his clinical notes a visit from 14 months ago, during which my grandmother had come in accompanied by my uncle. She had seemed confused. She had referred to her attorney as "that man my son uses," which Dr. Hensley found notable since she had used Mr. Forsyth for 2 decades. She had mentioned, unprompted, that she'd signed some papers and wasn't entirely sure what they said. Dr. Hensley had flagged it at the time. He'd called Adult Protective Services himself, somehow, and this is the part that still makes me sick. That report had gotten lost in the system. It was never investigated. My grandmother had no one to advocate for her, and so nothing happened. Until now. I want to tell you about the moment I found out the IRS had gotten involved, because honestly it's the moment that made everything real. Ms. Archer called me on a Thursday afternoon in June. I was at my desk at work trying to focus on a quarterly audit, and I stepped out into the hallway to take the call. She said, "The prosecutor's office has been in contact with the IRS. It appears that your uncle failed to report the trust transfer as taxable income, and the amendment itself may have tax implications that weren't disclosed. They're looking at additional charges." I stood in that hallway for a solid 30 seconds without saying anything. She said, "Are you still there?" I said, "Yes, I'm here. I wasn't expecting that," she said. "These things have a way of unraveling. My uncle had not paid taxes on the transfer. He had also, it emerged during the investigation, used a portion of the redirected funds to pay off a personal line of credit. My mother had used some to renovate her kitchen, the kitchen in her own house, not my grandmother's. These were not complicated crimes. They were the crimes of people who thought no one was paying attention. They had forgotten that I was an accountant. When Ms. Archer presented my financial analysis to the prosecutor, a timeline of the account cross-referenced against my uncle's known debts and my parents' home improvement records. The prosecutor described it as some of the clearest documentation of financial exploitation she had seen in a case of this type. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that the skills Grandma Cecile pushed me to develop, be careful, learn how things work, protect yourself, were the exact skills that protected her even after she was gone. The trust amendment was invalidated by the probate court in September. The house was returned to the estate. The investment accounts, what remained of them, after my uncle's line of credit and my mother's kitchen renovation, were returned as well. My uncle pled guilty to 1 count of exploitation of a vulnerable adult in October. He was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to pay $127,000 in restitution, and required to complete 200 hours of community service. The criminal fine was $15,000. My mother was not criminally charged. The prosecutor determined she had been a secondary beneficiary rather than a primary actor, though Ms. Archer made clear that this was a matter of the prosecutor's discretion, and not an indication that what she did was acceptable. She was, however, named in the civil suit and required to repay $43,000 for the kitchen renovation and other expenses funded by the redirected assets. My father, who had thrown that folder at the wall, who had told me I was ungrateful, who had stood in my grandmother's kitchen with a cup of coffee like he owned the place, was not a party to the financial scheme itself. He hadn't known the details, or so he claimed, and the evidence supported that, more or less. But he had known enough to cover for them. He had known enough to try to get me out of that house before I could look too closely at anything. I don't know what to do with him. I'm still working on that part. The estate was distributed according to the original will. The one from before the amendment, the one that had been sitting in that folder, the one I'd gathered off the floor and carried out in my arms like it was something precious. Because it was. Grandma Cecile had left the house to me, with a provision that the proceeds from any sale be used for education or housing, per her wishes. She'd left a small portion to a church she'd attended for 30 years. She'd left her jewelry and her Bible to a cousin of hers who'd been close to her in childhood. She had left my mother and her brother a combined total of $8,000. Enough, as her original attorney told Ms. Archer, to make clear she hadn't forgotten them. Just enough to make the point. She had known. I think she had always known what they were. I think the dementia had made her vulnerable to them in a way she never would have been otherwise. And I think that's the thing I'll carry with me the longest. Not the money, not the house, not the legal victory, but the knowledge that she saw them clearly and loved me anyway, and tried to protect me even when she no longer had the capacity to protect herself. I sold the house in November. The market in Dayton wasn't what it would have been a few years prior, but I walked away with enough to put a down payment on a place of my own in Columbus, and enough left over to start a fund in her name at the community college where she'd taken her teacher certification courses back in 1967. The fund is for first-generation students in the accounting and finance program. I want them to know what I know. I want them to learn how things work before they need to. I want them to be able to sit still in a room full of people who expect them to fall apart and keep their face and pick up every piece of paper off the floor. Because that's what she taught me, and it saved everything.